and almost sharper than the worst of our reasoned fears regarding those others. Then came a flash of anticlimax as the white shape sidled into a lateral archway to our left to join two others of its kind which had summoned it in raucous tones. For it was only a penguin, albeit of a huge, unknown species, larger than the greatest of the known king penguins and monstrous in its combined albinism and virtual eyelessness. When we had followed the thing into the archway and turned both our torches on the indifferent and uneasy group of three, we saw that they were all eyeless albinos of the same unknown and gigantic species. Their size reminded us of some of the archaic penguins depicted in the old one's sculptures, and it did not—
Lube once had a dog of his own. When he was 12 or 13 years old, an emaciated stray mongrel had one summer evening peered through a hole in the fence and watched him as he sat in a corner of the yard hunched over his tin basin of pork and potatoes. The dog had sat staring with hopeless longing at the pieces that fell into the dust as Lube crammed the food into his mouth, until, unable to restrain itself any longer, it made a frantic and despairing foray into the yard, snatched a loathly ort from under Lube's feet, and scrambled in terror back through the hole. Lube took no notice whatever. The dog, observing this, made a second raid, again without retribution. By the time the basin was empty, the ground was clear of food, and the dog was sitting beside Lube, waiting for the next scrap to fall. Shriek, a yelp of pure, helpless rage, and struck him again. In the kitchen, Lube sat without movement for some time. Then his hand opened, lay so for a moment, and clenched again. He repeated the movement 2 or 3 times. He rose ponderously, lurched out through the kitchen door. Ironically, they have volunteered to put me on the welfare rolls under the name of Tom Perkins. That also caused a good deal of laughter. Day after day, as I cleaned the spittoons, 3-pound coffee cans, actually, and mopped the foul floor, my mind was occupied by a sustained effort to discover, through the application of the most rigorous logic, an offer which I declined. A theory to account for my presence in a world where my presence is impossible. This was after my parole from the state hospital, after I had achieved a measure of resignation to my plight. The initial stages of my analysis were simple enough. I postulated that any occurrence, anywhere,
create perfect apocrypha. I could therefore incarnate what for him is the ideal author, that is, the author who is dissolved in the cloud of fictions that covers the world with its thick sheath. And since for him artifice is the true substance of everything, the author who devised a perfect system of artifices would succeed in identifying himself with the whole.
I must stop thinking of my conversation yesterday with that Marana.
I, too, would like to erase myself, and find for each book another I, another voice, another name.
Tracks made clear. Not long afterward, a steep descent in a long, low, doorless, and peculiarly sculptureless corridor led us to believe that we were approaching the tunnel mouth at last. We had passed 2 more penguins and heard others immediately ahead, and the corridor ended in a prodigious open space which made us gasp involuntarily. A perfect inverted hemisphere, obviously deep underground, fully 100 feet in diameter and 50 feet high, with low archways opening around all parts of the circumference but one, and that one yawning cavernously with a black, arched aperture which broke the symmetry of the vault to a height of nearly 15 feet. It was the entrance to the great abyss. In this vast hemisphere, whose concave roof was impressively though decadently carved to a likeness of the primordial celestial dome, a few albino penguins waddled, aliens there, but indifferent and unseeing. The black tunnel yawned indefinitely off at a steep descending grade,
said Faye, a look of utter contempt on her face. What age do you think we live in? The Archon is in charge in name only, and the generals and governors answer her pleas only when they please. They're more concerned with fighting one another than the bandits at the moment. The brave should step forward to defend what is theirs, and make a fortune and name for themselves. Not everyone is meant to live by the tip of a blade, said Ava. Toiling in the mines may not be very glamorous or lead to riches, but it is fun following you. I'm glad to know head on his shoulders. Her eyes widening while parsing Ava's words. At length,
As she bent over, I saw bare nape below her gathered hair, a fine black down, which seemed to continue along the
Shaw has a good
line of her back.
Faye stared at Ava. Faye stared at Ava.
I was concentrated on looking at it. When I felt on me
Far safer than
Mr. Okeda's motionless eye examining me. Certainly he realized I saw on her practicing on his daughter's neck my ability to isolate sensations, both because the impression of that tender
as though she had trouble.
down on the pale skin had overpowered me imperiously, and because
Sparsely decorated with cartouches of conventional design in a late decadent style, and all the construction and carvings were marvelously well preserved. The floor was quite clear, except for a slight detritus bearing outgoing penguin tracks and the inward tracks of those others. The further one advanced, the warmer it became, so that we were soon unbuttoning our heavy garments. We wondered whether there were any actual igneous manifestations below, and whether the waters of that sunless sea were hot.
I did not look away.
After a short distance, the masonry gave place to solid rock, though the tunnel kept the same proportions and presented the same aspect of carved regularity. Occasionally, its varying grade became so steep that grooves were cut in the floor. Several times we noted the mouths of small lateral galleries not recorded in our diagrams, none of them such as to complicate the problem of our The nameless scent of such things was very distinct. Doubtless it was suicidally foolish to venture into that tunnel under the known conditions, but the lure of the unplumbed is stronger in certain persons than most suspect. Indeed, it was just such a lure which had brought us to this unearthly polar waste turn, and all of them welcome as possible refuges in case we met with unwelcome entities on their way back from the abyss.
Of Rowanflare are even more arrogant. You and me are like weeds, disposable trash. You won't find happiness. Things are changing, said Shaw, growing more impassioned. All the governors and generals are recruiting. There are opportunities. You will never be revealed, declared Ava, fairly shouting. That is final. Just because you failed, it doesn't mean that I will too. Maybe when my nature is revealed, I will be someone who matters. Ava stilled as though she had been slapped. At length, she struggled to speak past the lump in her throat. You don't understand. But Shaw had ripped off his gloves and tossed them down on the ground. Don't bother with dinner for me tonight. I can't be with someone
else. When he reached the house, he climbed the discolored stone steps, entered, and took his seat in the window. His hand was slowly clenching and unclenching. Something new had happened, was happening to him. He was, improbably, in the grip of an emotion. Somewhere in the ruinous labyrinth of his mind, there was adumbrated a feeling of loss, something nameless that was forever gone. There was no way for him to weigh the matter, to reflect upon the strangeness of this phenomenon. He could only react instinctively.
Why not admit that my dissatisfaction reveals an excessive ambition, perhaps a megalomaniac delirium? For the writer who wants to annul himself in order to give voice to what is outside him, two paths open. Either write a book that could be the unique book that exhausts the whole in its pages, or write all books to pursue the whole through its partial images. The unique book, which contains the whole, could only be the sacred text, the total word revealed. But I do not believe totality can be contained in language. My problem is what remains outside, the unwritten, the unwritable. The only way left me is that of writing all books, writing the books of all possible authors. If I think I must write one book, all the problems of how this book should be and how it should not be block me. Circulate in this valley. Literary agents awaiting my new novel, for which they have already collected advances from publishers all over the world. Advertising agents who want my characters to wear certain articles of clothing and drink certain fruit juices. Electronic technicians who insist on finishing my unfinished novels with a computer. I try to go out as little as possible. I avoid the village. If I want to take a walk, I choose the mountain trails. Today I ran it.
There was no visible vapors at the mouth, but this was doubtless due to the lack of contrasting cooler air. The temperature was rapidly ascending, and we were not surprised to come upon a careless heap of material shudderingly familiar to us. It was composed of furs and tent cloth taken from Lake's camp, and we did not pause to study the bizarre forms into which the fabric had been slashed. Slightly beyond this point, we noticed a decided increase in the size and number of side galleries, and concluded that the densely honeycombed region beneath the higher foothills must now have been reached. The nameless scent was now curiously mixed with another, and scarcely less offensive odor, of what nature we could not guess, though we thought of decaying organisms and perhaps unknown subterranean fungi. Then came a startling expansion of the tunnel, for which the carvings had not prepared us, a broadening and rising into a lofty, natural-looking elliptical cavern with a level floor some 75 feet long and 50 broad.
It writes, "This is the special bliss that I see appear in the reader's face, and which is denied me."
On the wall facing my desk hangs a poster somebody gave me.
The dog Snoopy is sitting at a typewriter, and in the cartoon you read the sentence, "It was a dark and stormy night." Every time I sit down here, I read, "It was a dark and stormy night," and the impersonality of that incipit seems to open the passage.
The will to fight, to resist, to bite into the steel legs with her bare teeth in a last expression of her indomitable spirit. Blood boiled inside Ava. To see some kind of mechanical monstrosity so splendid, so glorious and alive, brought down a few cowards hiding safe in custody was intolerable. Abruptly, she stood up, showing her face above the sea of swaying arook stalks. With a low growl, she focused her attention inward, in the manner she had been taught 7 years ago. The burn of the revelation wine coursed through her veins, the bitter taste of 1,000 spices still on her tongue. Her mind was storm-tossed, and it was all she could do to keep herself from stumbling as she shuffled forward. Together with the other candidates, she was led into the Hall of Reflection in the dark warren of secret tunnels under the palace. One by one, they were guided into the Chamber of Mirrors, where they would finally be shown their true form. All the years of pious prayers at the shrines of the gods, of reading and memorizing the words of the sages, of her parents scrimping and saving for the chance.
Legible world, without center, without ego, without I. When you think about it, this total writer could be a very humble person, what in America they call a ghost writer, a professional of recognized usefulness, even if not of great prestige. The anonymous editor who gives book form to what other people have to tell but are unable or lack the time to write. He is the writing hand that gives words to existences too busy existing.
Over the field with the chill of the evening, veiling the landscape around her in a blood-tinged haze. From time to time, a red-winged blackbird or two erupted from the vengeful sea, streaking through the fog like flying fish, skimming above the waves, trilling and was it the cry of a blackbird? It was louder, harder, more relentless. And along with the metallic trilling, she could hear another noise like her own panting breath, but more desperate and wilder. Ducking down among the aruk stalks, she peered into the thickening mist and willed her thumping heart to still so that she could listen. A disturbance roiled the sea of grass in the distance, as though a ship reaching. A sound that resembled the clang of metallic scales. Ava stopped, panting. She was tired, and the light was failing. It was dangerous to spend the night out in the wild, especially in this unfathomable sea of grass. She stared at the ground, at the openings between the thorn-encrusted stalks. Would she? Could she? Should she? No. She rejected the thought, her heart throbbing with fear and doubt. Ever since her return from Rowanflare, she had kept her secret to herself, unwilling to revisit the truth that had shattered her family, that had left her parents disappointed, that had buried her in shame. Again, the trilling. Like metal plates grinding against one another, sending a shiver down her spine. With a start, she realized that the sound... The attendant roared, his gargantuan face twisted into a look of disgust. A waste of time! This is what happens when you dig through trash and pick among weeds. Another voice. A clap of thunder. Standards. Don't they care about standards in the prefectures? Instinctively, she bolted forward just as a massive foot, attached to a leg as thick as the trunk of a 100-year-old tree, slammed down into the space she had occupied but a moment earlier. She found herself in front of a bright wall and a fur-clad
work available to a nameless unperson. They call me Tom Perkins. I don't know where they got that. Back when I still talked, I used to ask them to use my real name, but the request always generated so much laughter that I gave it up. At that, I am one of the hole through which the hay was hauled into the mow. It scuttled up with the agility of a great feral monkey. A startled pigeon flapped in confusion and then flew hastily through the opening. And the thing that had been Sam Dappling leaped for it, wildly cutting with its sword. The pigeon rose gracefully and curved back to alight on the roof. The thing sailed outward and dropped, still slicing and hacking at the air through which it fell. It struck the hard-packed earth and bounced slightly, and was still.
Shifts of her body in the deck chair, in her legs, which she crosses or extends.
At times, it seems to me that the distance between my writing and her reading is unbridgeable, that whatever I write bears the stamp of artifice and incongruity. If what I am writing were to appear on the polished surface of the page she is reading, it would rasp like a fingernail in a pane, and she would fling the book away with horror. At times I convince myself that the woman is reading my true book, the one I should have written long
Science fiction in 1979. It may be that none of this happened. That is badly put. Let me say it another way. None of this will have happened at the instant, which I believe must come eventually, the instant that Lube permits my great-grandfather to pass unscathed through the drawing-room door. I believe that one day Lube will permit it. I think he must. Because if he does not, my existence is an impossibility. And I do exist. Cogito ergo sum. Breathing, thinking human being. as solid and sentient as any of the degenerates who surround me here. As I skulk about this decrepit travesty of my native town, I reflect endlessly upon my impossible existence, upon the resemblances and differences between this world and my own, upon an explanation for the situation in which I find myself. And I have found the explanation, and in finding it, I find some hope. I can only wait.
Eva knew that she didn't have a lot of time. Without breaking to rest her sore jaws, she began to hop back and forth, dancing among the felled stalks of Uruk like a frenzied beaver. 1 over, 2 across, 1 over, 2 across. Tirelessly, Eva leaped and hopped, keeping her ears slicked back, clutching her front paws tightly around the fibrous strands. It was the same pattern that she used to weave her gloves out of strips of mind.